I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Ford School's 7th Josh Rosenthal Education Fund Lecture. I'd like to start by actually telling you a little bit about the history of this lecture series before I introduce our speaker. Josh Rosenthal was a 1979 graduate of the University of Michigan who died in the World Trade Center attack on September 11th, 2001. Josh had earned a master's degree in public policy from Princeton University, and he had a very deep, abiding interest in policy analysis issues as well as international affairs, which led him to work in the field of international finance. After his death, Josh's mother, Marilyn Rosenthal, who was a long-term faculty member here at the University of Michigan, sought a way with her family to try to make some positive meaning out of those events of 9/11. And she and a number of others worked to establish this fund, which has enabled the Ford School to bring a series of very distinguished speakers to try to help us to continue learning from and thinking about the many very important issues that were raised by that set of experiences. So the intent is to have speakers share their insights, to foster dialogue among us and others, and to really hopefully generate a greater understanding of both the causes and the consequences and implications of 9/11. We're very grateful for the support of the Rosenthal family and those who've contributed to that fund. We're extremely excited this year to be able to welcome the Rosenthal lecturer, Dave Marash. He has nearly 50 years of experience in broadcast journalism. Most recently, he anchored news from Washington for the global news channel Al Jazeera English. Before accepting the Al Jazeera post, Dave served as the chief international correspondent for the ABC News program Nightline for 16 years. His reporting for Nightline was wide-ranging and highly acclaimed, earning him 3 Emmys, which recognized his work on the wars in the former Yugoslavia, his coverage of the Oklahoma City bombings, and his coverage of the explosion of the TWA Flight 800. Before he began reporting for Nightline in 1989, Dave spent more than a decade in local news in New York and Washington, D.C. He was a correspondent for ABC News 2020 from 1978 to 1980, where he won a National Emmy Award for his reporting on the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And during that time, Marash also substituted for 2 weeks as Nightline anchor. His very journalistic background included a stint as anchor for ESPN's Baseball Tonight. He's published articles in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Journalism Review. We couldn't be more pleased to welcome Dave Marash to Ann Arbor and to the Ford School. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Collins, and I want to thank the supporters of the Josh Rosenthal Education Fund for making this lecture series possible. And I also want to thank Jill Crane and Laura Lee for their help in all the logistics of getting me here on time and in shape. The subject of my speech is "The medium is not the message." I used to have a really nice, encapsulated, sort of wise guy, Dr. Samuel Johnson, follow-up to that, which was, if you believe the medium is the message, don't open the next telegram you get. But of course, that medium went away, and nobody gets the reference anymore. But the medium is not the message. The medium may be the envelope, or it may be the letter carrier, but the message is the content. It is what is inside the medium, and it is what counts. Now, of course, some media do carry some messages more conveniently, more efficiently, and more profitably than others. But the imperative to put those values, comfort, convenience, and money first, have nothing to do with any inherent qualities of any medium. It comes directly from the people who own and operate the media. Today, political and economic considerations are limiting both the breadth and the depth of the news that we as Americans process every day. For some years now, news offered to Americans, especially via television, which presently remains the dominant source of news for most Americans, is dangerously limited and somewhat purposefully, determinedly shallow. Study after study documents that fewer stories from fewer parts of the world take up more and more of the American news media's airtime and page and screen space. As one close professional observer, Mark Jerkowitz of the Project for Excellence in Journalism, said, "More choices for news does not mean more news to choose from. In fact, every year, the news media show Americans less of the world." This form of auto-lobotomy institutionalizes ignorance. And ignorance is a very negative quality, especially for a nation that aspires to democratic decision-making. Consider the context of today's convocation, 9/11/2001. The only way to redeem that date, the only way to really honor or repay those people living and dead whose lives were changed by 9/11 is to learn from it. So what have we learned from 9/11, and particularly what have America's news media taught us about 9/11? Unfortunately, the truth is that much of what we have learned is simply false. Let's start with the utterly wrong notion that 9/11/2001 marked the dawn of a dangerous new world. Now, this misconception depended on a nation and news media who are willing to ignore the fact that parts of the world had been living for years before 2001, with the realization that all of modern life contains a very low percentage but real risk of random violence caused by criminals or terrorists. And this is not a function of a rising tide of religious fundamentalism or Islamist rage against modernity or the West. It has much more to do with the increasing consumer access to ever-improving technologies of portable firepower and intimate and mass communication. The best defense against the threat of 9/11 is something that the United States preeminently has and preeminently had before 9/11. And that is an open society filled with socially responsible and patriotic people who tend to cough up conspirators the way cats do hairballs. The fifth column stops here because the American people are not alienated from their government, and they resent people who try to alienate them from their government or attack their government. After 9/11, the promoters of that bogus bad new world concept went hardly challenged, hardly even questioned by politicians or journalists. And thus they were able to beget a new political rule book whose toughness, they claimed, was necessary to the survival of the American Republic. The new rules closed down the American society by increasing the limitations on immigration and foreclosing crossings of the border, and by much more intrusive surveillance of both citizens and residents of the United States. Outside our borders, the new rule book post 9/11 has been marked by repeated quick-draw American use of military and paramilitary force. At the heart of this new rule book is a new concentration of executive power. In the American constitutional context, this has meant unprecedented claims of unmediated authority in the office of the president. For global rule of law, it has meant aggressive assertions of American exceptionalism. We opt out of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. We opt often for our own aggressive sanctions or intervention, sometimes diplomatic, sometimes legal, sometimes extra-legal, sometimes violent. And these interventions are often taken notwithstanding the advice of our allies or the perceptions of those who will be directly affected or their neighbors. Unfortunately, this new blueprint for executive action appeals not just to the Bush White House, but to the Putin White House. And the Russian intervention and violence in Georgia comes very much on the heels of the precedent of American interventions beyond its own borders. And so when President Bush and Vice President Cheney, both in the same words, decry, quote, bullying and intimidation in the 21st century, unquote, the laughter, the anger in the rest of the world comes from a perception that these are politicians who are reprehending the very tactics that they themselves have used and largely introduced into the 21st century. There's little mention, though, of this among the American news media, and little curiosity as to why it is that President and now Prime Minister Putin would engage in actions which actually are in many ways counterproductive, certainly to his own international stature and to his nation's economy and political reputation. What is it that has been done to put Putin in such a hyper-aggressive, uncaring frame of mind? Well, all of that seems to come under the rubric of it happened over there, not our concern, when it comes to coverage by the American media. And the odd thing is that this comes at a time of technological revolution, where low light, lightweight cameras, and instantaneous satellite links for communication have improved emphatically to new levels our ability to communicate back here what is happening over there, what exists over there. But this is expensive and often dangerous to do, and the American news media are more and more free to ignore the opportunity, much less the responsibility, to cover the rest of the world regardless of expense or danger. According to the Washington Post, in the first 4 years after 9/11, the years 2002 through 2006, the number of American newspaper reporters stationed overseas was reduced by 25%. The Tyndall Report, which watches American television, has chronicled a similar diminution of reporters and bureaus overseas by all the American networks. And the latest innovation, networks dispatching one-person bureaus to odd, assorted, and often unstable and dangerous corners of the world, is not only no professional match for what has been destroyed, it is, in my opinion, morally and potentially mortally irresponsible. Not only are there fewer international journalists covering fewer stories, their jobs are being restructured to make the quality of their coverage worse, and, as I was hinting before, potentially their lives shorter. First, let's look at quality. New media like cell phones and text, and new technologies that are reforming the old media like print newspapers or radio and television, are changing the world of news gathering. Re-engineering is the phrase of the day. Re-engineering meaning reducing the workforce to reduce the budget. Multitasking to make up for the reduction in personnel. But in the case of broadcast journalism, the skills required to bring a decent product to air, shooting videotape and editing it, producing a story and shepherding it through to the home office so that it can be broadcast or put on the internet, much less researching, reporting, consolidating, and writing the story, all involve very different skills, many of which are not cognate one to another, and rarely are all of them contained within a single body. Multitask journalism looks good on the fiscal balance sheet, but in every other way, especially with regard to the basic purpose of journalism, which is to deliver true and transparent and focused and organized information, multitasking is completely out of whack. and it's whacking America into dangerous ignorance, and it threatens to get American reporters whacked in the old New York mob Soprano sense. As more and more news organizations add shooting video to the daily requirements of their personnel, let them please consider this one fact. Unlike print reporters or television or radio correspondents whose eyes can remain free to scan reality even as they're broadcasting their reports, and unlike experienced still shooters who reflexively shift their eyes from their view screen or rangefinder to reality in between clicks of the shutter, video journalism requires shooting in sequences, requires the shooter to focus his or her attention on that view screen or rangefinder for what can be excruciatingly long periods of time. In a battlefield or riot situation, seconds measure a long period of time. Sending people out alone, and the major American networks like ABC and CNN are doing this more and more. Sending people out alone in unstable situations to do video reportage is simply morally irresponsible. It's gonna get somebody killed. On television, the news product is also being re-engineered. After all, say the bean counters, why spend money, why even risk these lives to send people somewhere when you can fill the airtime equally well by having people sit in a studio and talk about that somewhere? In the microcosm of money trumping McLuhan, television news, cable as dramatically as at the networks, has been abandoning the very package that it was literally made to transmit, the videotaped report from the scene, shot, organized, edited, and transmitted. Instead of these packages, you now get live two ways between the anchor and the correspondent. Let me remind you, when the correspondent is conversing with the anchor and looking at the camera, he literally doesn't know what's going on behind his back, much less what's going on in what can be a complex or even a dangerous real world behind him. And furthermore, as the correspondent's responsibility becomes more and more the live two-way, he or she becomes literally tethered to the live spot and has no opportunity to go out and about, to wander the streets, to get the sense of place and time literally up their nose, to talk with people, to, I think it's called, report. They don't have time to report because they're too busy doing live reports. Who's kidding whom here? And what mistaken impressions have been conveyed under the rubric breaking news or developing story? One example that struck me was the breaking news label stayed up for hours during the story called Hurricane Gustav. And a picture was kept up with the breaking news logo beside it of wind-whipped waves overtopping the levee of the Industrial Canal in New Orleans. Both the picture and the label were kept up hours after the storm had passed and was clearly nothing more than a significant local weather event. The pictures and the breaking news label was kept off after those very waters in the picture had receded by 2 feet and weren't even lapping at the top of, much less overtopping the levee. And yet the pictures and the conversation of the anchors implied that imminent danger was still breaking, still an imminent situation. Now again, it's not the media that is sending these false messages. There's nothing inherent in television or live television news in this kind of misrepresentation. This is the fault of the people who own, run, and yes, enact television news. And it's got to stop, because the effects on how America understands the world and how America understands events is really being radically eroded. All this endless emphasis on live, on now, comes at the expense of then, of context, of history, of sorting out events. Correspondents are now tasked, well, tell us what we're looking at. They're never asked, well, how does what we're looking at fit into the history or the culture, and what are its implications for tomorrow or the next day? It's all a celebration of live, actual, impending, threatening, menacing falsity. We saw this in the coverage of the World Trade Center bombings. Today's television news eradicates what needs to be learned from events in its lust to sell them as must-see news, as must-see now, as must-see to protect yourself. The hawkers of the post-9/11 New World Now needed to fudge or forget these facts. 8 years before 2001, another group of fundamentalist Islamist terrorists staged an attack on the World Trade Center. They, like those who struck on 9/11, were apparently directed by Osama bin Laden's chief of operations, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. The earlier group was physically led by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew, Ramzi Youssef. This earlier group had real deficits in training and discipline, and fortunately in success. They failed in their plan, essentially to topple one tower into the other, destroying them both. But at that point, the dissimilarities end. The truth is, in 1993, more or less the same group of people, led by the same group of people, acting on the same moral and political imperatives as the 9/11-2001 group of people, tried to do something radically similar. And between 1993 and 2001, several other similar terrorist plots enacted in the name of Islamic fanaticism and aimed at New York City institutions and the subways, bridges, and tunnels were thwarted by effective police and prosecutorial action. But none of that got examined. Rarely did it get examined in the context of 2001, and it had largely been ignored for the 8 years before. And so an opportunity for Americans to know an important enemy, to know its tactics, to know its organizing principles, to know its grievances, was lost. I'm not saying that this is what prevented the preemption of 9/11-2001, but it's certainly that ignorance helped to define the response to it. And it's an ignorance that we simply can't afford. And again, there was nothing inherent in any of the media that covered or didn't cover this story that forced the failure of journalists to report on the conspiracies, on the perpetrators, and on the investigators and the prosecutors who thwarted them. The breakdown had nothing to do with clarity or fuzziness, heat or cold of the pictures. It had nothing to do with the occasion of the broadcast or the room or space or company in which it was viewed. It had nothing to do with the bandwidth of the blog file. It had to do with simple bad reporting, bad editing, bad leadership. Long before 9/11, the world was already changing. And states and policies, intelligence agencies, police departments, and in many parts of the world, ordinary citizens were also changing with it and changing their expectations of daily life. But in America, few people noticed, and few had it called to their attention by the news media. Now, part of that was a political failure, but much more of it was a professional failure by America's journalists. A failure to find the dots, much less to connect them. A failure to assign coverage of a slow-moving story. You know, slow-moving stories like the state of the economy, or particularly the state of the job market, or particularly the state of the credit market or the housing credit market, do move slowly, do change subtly, do require beat reporters who can measure the changes because they can see them over time. News budgets no longer contain the money for beat reporting, and it's considered to be too hard to get the interest of the audience for these slow-moving, non-spectacular, non-violent stories. And yet think about our lives. Public health stories, tax and spend stories, quality of education stories. These are the stories that define our lives. These are the stories through which we move every day. These are stories in which superior information could lead to superior judgments and policies, which could lead to superior cultural and social outcomes. Ignorance defeats all of that. The Project for American Journalism in the year 2007, 6 years after 9/11, did an annual survey of what was covered in the American news, and they discovered, it's 2007, that 2 stories ate up 1/3 of the whole news hole. One was the American elections of 2008, the other was Iraq. And in their analysis of Iraq, and by the way, 1 out of every 6 stories that appeared on the front page of 44 large American newspapers, and on the nightly news of the networks, and on the major news shows of the cable news stations, 1 out of 6 stories dealt with Iraq from one of 3 perspectives. Stories about the situation in Iraq, stories about the political debate in Washington about Iraq, and stories about the impact on the American home front, mostly on the families of veterans serving in Iraq. But what about stories on the impact of the war on Iraqis in Iraq? What about the stories about the impact of the war on their mostly Islamic, mostly Arabic neighbors? What about the impact of the war on how America is viewed and how its reputation is rated all around the world? Not much interest in that. That was all over there, not fit to bring back to here. The result? Ignorance. And as 9/11 should have taught us, and as the war in Iraq has to teach us, ignorance kills. Ignorance in action is presumption. Consequential action taken on a gut instinct in the absence of any objective evidence, often in the presence of attempted dissuasion. Presumption can be summed up in 3 words: we know best. You may have suffered from terrorist actions or rampant criminal violence for years, but it's only when it occurs in America that it becomes a new world-changing event. Presumption. Presumption that Saddam Hussein was somehow connected to the attacks on 9/11, and that he was amassing an armory of weapons of mass destruction, predicated the war in Iraq. Self-congratulatory presumption about the effects of shock and awe air warfare and high mobility ground warfare left the U.S. undermanned, under-equipped, under-armed to control blooming asymmetrical hotspots around Iraq that started blooming shortly after the declaration of mission accomplished. We simply had too few people to monitor, or much less secure, vast dumps of arms that the Saddam regime had left behind. Other people picked them up and put them to insurgent use. Army Lieutenant General William S. Wallace summed it up. He said, quote, "This is not the war we gamed for. Presumption can kill you too. But ignorance is really what swamped our troops in the years of occupation that followed the weeks of full-scale warfare in Iraq. Because the United States lacked both diplomatic and intelligence personnel in Iraq, and because the world's news media had all but abandoned trying to cover the country in the face of Saddam's very, very restrictive reporting climate there, ignorance ruled America and most of the world's views of what was the reality in Iraq. So the invasion depended on sparse and inconclusive information from our allies and a lot of self-interested talk from America's cohort of favorite Iraqi exiles. We learned to our great sorrow that most of them were men of little influence in Iraq and less insight. Most of them had been out of the country for 10 years, few of them had been missed. America went into the perilous business of occupation, all but blind. Much of this, by the way, was known in real time. If you were over there, you could see it. But little of it got reported. It was preempted by reports on how the troops were doing, or the latest attempt to do good in Iraq. The reality of the swamp into which these attempts were sinking was not covered. It was mostly about Iraqis, and they were their problem. The difficulties that face any occupying force could have and should have been well appreciated in the United States. It should have been part of the American public discussion, both in Congress and in people's living rooms, before the invasion occurred. U.S. troops had actually served for years as occupiers in Bosnia and in Kosovo. Obviously much easier assignments than Iraq, but still difficult and complex in their own right, and full of precursor problems that should have been studied and should have been known before America attempted an occupation in Iraq. But again, few from the political world ever bothered to go to the Balkans. And trying to get news from the Balkans on the air in the United States was almost impossible. One of the great innovations of television is minute-by-minute measuring, which they tend to do only in prime time. By 1993, ABC had discovered through its minute-by-minute monitoring that if you mentioned Bosnia, you could see people flee from their screens like sand deserting the top of an hourglass. It was bad news and nobody wanted to hear it. And the network acquiesced. Can't make them watch what they don't want to watch, so why try? The coverage of the Balkans, both during the war, but especially when the bang-bang ended and the immediate violence of battlefield videography was gone, was truly pathetic. It was an almost total void. And again, it left us not knowing things that just years later it turned out were very, very important for us to have known. One of the things that we would have noted in particularly Kosovo is that when your troops don't know until the bullets are actually coming at them who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, unless somebody tells them, they're in a world of trouble. And in Iraq, particularly in the first 2 to 3 years of the American occupation, the American Army was fed lots of bad information by lots of self-interested people who were evening up local grudges and scores and using American troops who thought that they were battling insurgents to do the dirty work for them. This is a problem that continues in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, the problem has been compounded by a major shift in tactics by the United States military, which again has gone largely unreported, unobserved, and undiscussed. Over the last 2 years, what was essentially a ground anti-terrorist campaign has shifted to an air war. And when you fire from the air, your chances of hitting a wrong target are greater, and the consequences of it are almost certainly greater. And, you know, the U.S. military is currently reinvestigating an incident in western Afghanistan in which, according to the United Nations, at least 90 civilians, most of them women and children, were killed by mistake on the basis, everybody now seems to conclude, of false intelligence supplied by one warlord against another. Should there be public debate about this shift in tactics? Should there be public apprehension of the cost that it has, both for the security of American troops in Afghanistan and for the stability of our relationship with the government of Afghanistan? Of course, we need to be talking about this and thinking about it. But our media are largely failing to put this on the public agenda, at great cost to the United States. But our ignorance in Iraq went way beyond who was who. Over the last 5 years of Saddam Hussein's miserable regime, there were very important shifts in the structure of power and obligation inside Iraq. Things you needed to know about how Iraqi society actually worked. And again, Americans, from the president and the vice president, from the generals to the captains, to the sergeants, to the privates, to the reporters, to the citizens, were almost perfectly ignorant of this. The image of Iraq before the war was of an absolute Saddam regime. Saddam in control of everything. Saddam's deciding everything. Saddam with a literal death grip on everyone in the country and his loyalty. Now, this was an image that Saddam very zealously tried to put forward. It was greatly in his interest to have it out there. It had, however, probably not been true for almost 10 years before our invasion, because the changes attendant upon the end of the first Gulf War, international sanctions, intrusive international weapons inspectors, civic unrest among the Kurdish and Shiite communities, started pushing the country towards chaos. And Saddam had to collaborate with this process. In order for him to secure smuggling routes out of Syria, he needed to make deals with the tribes and mafias of Al-Anbar province, most of them centered in Ramadi and in Fallujah. And the currency of these deals drew on 2 bank accounts. One, the literal treasury of the nation of Iraq. Saddam paid a lot of these people off or cut them in on the profits of their ventures. But much more was the effect on the Favors Bank, if you remember that wonderful concept. In the 1980s, if your son got drafted and you didn't want him to go to war, there was basically one pipeline that you could follow to get him out of his obligation, and that was through the Ba'ath Party, to the palace, to Saddam. But every time Saddam had to cut a deal with a local power center, whether that be a religious imam or a tribal sheikh, whether that was a local mafia leader or a renegade Ba'ath provincial power, he made that person a potential intervenor. So that when, let's say, your daughter got married and needed permission to relocate from province A to province B, rather than having to do that slow and terrifying process of petitioning Saddam through the Ba'ath, you could now go to the local intervener. You could go to the sheikh who was of your tribe, or you could go to the mafia boss who ran your neighborhood or corner, and you could say, could you fix this for me, and pay him the bribe and the obeisance. And Saddam had essentially bargained away these intervening powers. And as a result, more and more Iraqis developed new patterns of loyalty that basically short-circuited loyalty to Saddam, or even the notion of an Iraqi state or nation. By the time American forces occupied Iraq, it had become a chaos of local satrapies. And when the United States dithered in creating a new government, the way in which people got things done was through this local network. And they were the people to whom they became obligated, and they were the people to whom they became loyal. And so, when the United States announced its surge, and the Iraqi government promised that for the 5 brigades of American troops who would be introduced into Baghdad, 15 brigades of Iraqi troops would be assigned there to work with them, at least 1 out of every 3 people in those Iraqi brigades never showed up. It is presumed, and I think accurately, that many of them made a phone call or walked down the block and said, they want me to go to Baghdad and fight with the Americans. Sheikh, what do you think? And if the sheikh said, I don't think it's such a good idea, they didn't show. And this slowed and crippled the surge for several months before other things happened in Iraq that also changed the calculus there. Even today, this problem of what I call superseding loyalties has hardly improved. The combination of the tactical withdrawal of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army and the recruitment of the Sunni awakening movement militants as a stabilizing force, as well as the increased armed American troop presence known as the Surge, has definitely calmed things on the streets of Baghdad. But they have not strengthened the bands of unity and loyalty between the Iraqi government, a notion of the Iraqi state, and the Iraqi people. So what'll happen if and when America leaves? What'll even happen if and when America stops paying the weekly payroll of the Sunni awakening movement? Nobody knows for sure, but the one thing they do know is Americans will not be controlling what happens. It'll be the Iraqis who control it. Could this be a lesson that we could learn? That what is gained by force has to be held by force? And when it comes to force, the visiting team, AKA the occupiers, is always at a disadvantage. The weapons and communications that are readily available to any would-be insurgent movement that can find an appropriate grievance to unify its personnel around is endless. And it tips the whole balance of asymmetrical warfare against the visiting team, the conventional forces, the occupiers. People who have been in the field, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, another totally ignored American military, paramilitary adventure, have been worrying about these issues for years, but they haven't been talking about them in public, and largely the American news media has failed to bring this discussion, to bring these critically important problems to public attention. So for 7 years now, since 9/11, more Americans have died and bled. More American-funded programs have had ambiguous or even less success. And really, it wasn't until 2004 and a string of big investigative books that were based on reporters spending large amounts of time on the scene in Iraq and lots of time with other people who had spent even more time or mayhap even lived there, and I'm talking about books written by Anthony Shadid and Thomas Ricks, George Packer and Rajiv Chandrasekaran, just for examples. Until these books forced their way onto the public agenda, there was almost no attention being paid to what was actually happening in Iraq and why. And after the authors had been invited onto the talk shows and things had been talked through and argued over, the whole question shifted into the past tense and was forgotten. And why is that? Because there was an almost complete absence of on-the-scene reporting that could have either verified and underscored or refuted the facts in the of the arguments made in these books and made about these books in the discussions that followed their publication. It became an abstract argument, an ideological argument for many, but it was not grounded in fact. It was not grounded in knowledge. It was not grounded in reporting. A lot of this did have to do with personal security. And as somebody who personally opted out of Iraq because I felt that the ability that I had to truly report there did not balance with the risks of simply getting from the airport to the ABC bureau, it's a real consideration. Keeping a journalist or a team of journalists in Iraq literally costs tens of thousands of dollars a week in security costs alone. And this has sent many American news organizations home. The results, again, have just been catastrophic for reporting. According to content analysis from the Project for Excellence in Journalism, in 2007, Afghanistan, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, North Korea, Darfur, tensions between Washington and Moscow, and the emergence of the economies of China and India were among major global events that generated, quote, neither sustained coverage nor even intense short-term interest in the U.S. media. Now, interestingly, of all the stories that were studied by PEJ, the one that had the biggest gap between public interest and journalistic performance was gas prices. Almost everybody in America noticed what was happening at the gas pump and wanted to know more about it and what were the causes of it. And the media did not respond. And the fact that the growth of the economy of China was one of those disappeared stories is, of course, absolutely consequential to any informed discussion of what's going on with energy prices in the United States today. There was one Chinese story that got a lot of attention in 2007, and it was the story of the toxically painted children's toys. A real story, but also a real example of singling out a tree and not seeing the whole forest. In the Balkans in the 1990s, the American media established a preference for spectacular skirmishes over long-viewed strategic assessments of progress in a war. Over 3 years in Bosnia, the media stuck it out, but the minute the bang-bang ended, they went home. And the Iraqi reality, the Iraqi point of view, they went home, declaring victory and determining that the expense and danger of coverage simply wasn't going to be repaid by viewer interest. Of course, how can you be interested in something you don't know anything about? You know, our job as journalists is to make you interested. I remember when I first started anchoring in television and had my first visit from a consultant. He noted that I actually had a background teaching college English. And he said to me, you know, Mr. Marash, you've got to make a choice. On television, you can either entertain or educate. And education is not what we're about. And I looked at the guy and I said, well, now I know something about you. You slept through school. Because if you were awake, you would know that good teaching is entertaining. That a good educator interests you in the material that you may not have known was interesting before he presented it to you in a way that hooked you. Television is much happier to sell the pre-sold, to repopularize the already popular. It, of course, turns news into old, because what's new hasn't been market tested, and so you don't know whether people want it, so it's safer not to tell them about it. In Iraq, American media provided truly remarkable 24/7 coverage of the conquest of the Saddam regime. But the longer the occupation ground on, the lower the interest in the story became, and the fewer journalists who stuck it out to report, and with good reason, because their editors in London or New York or Paris were much less interested in the story, and their labors were much less likely to be rewarded with airtime or page space. So what happened in Iraq during occupation, and particularly what happened to Iraqis and how this affected their attitudes, has gone almost completely unreported. And you know what? What they think matters. For example, there are two shock issues now that have American diplomats reeling back on their heels and the White House puzzling what to do. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has said he will not authorize any further use of American troops without a firm out date for their leaving, and not combat troops, all troops. He wants to know when they're going to be gone. And then there's the question of criminal immunity for American forces in Iraq. He doesn't want to grant that either somehow. Well, in 2003 and 2004, when I was in Iraq, those were red-hot issues, both of them. By 2004, 80% of the Iraqi people were telling pollsters they wanted the Americans to leave as soon as possible. I mean, the way this is translated in Washington is, oh, Maliki is just saying this for public consumption. Well, what does it tell you that what the public in Iraq wants to consume is a firm out date? They want to say goodbye. This matters. This affects the security of our forces and what they can accomplish. And it's certainly going to affect the Iraq after we leave. And there is going to come a time when we leave. Again, this doesn't get discussed, it doesn't get covered. Even in the middle of the longest, loudest presidential campaign in American history, which is still going on and still not discussing any of these issues. Instead, we hear charges of surrender in Iraq or claims of victory in Iraq, and I defy you to tell me what either of those terms mean, or if in fact they have any meaning in the reality of Iraq. There are still huge unsettled problems in Iraq. What to do about Kirkuk, where Kurds, Arabs, and Turkmen all have mutually exclusive and very heavily armed claims to control the territory. What's going to happen with the incomplete civil war between the Shiites who back the al-Hakim faction and the Shiites who back the al-Sadr faction? Both of them are well armed, both of them have very heavily trained militias, and neither one has forgotten or forgiven a thing about their grievances. And what about those Sunnis who joined the awakening movement and accepted an American promise that they would be integrated into the new Iraq? So far, the al-Maliki government is at best dragging its heels, at worst flatly refusing to integrate the overwhelming majority of these Sunnis. Well, they're well armed, they're well organized, and if they're not absorbed, they will be firing into the tent from the outside rather than walking in the tent from the inside. So more predictable than either victory or surrender in Iraq, in fact, the most predictable thing about Iraq is continued ignorance, continued distraction from the reality of what's there, and the cost of this will be measured in American lives and bodies and treasure and reputation. And the fault for all this does not lie in the media or any medium. It lies in those of us who operate the media and those of us who accept the services of the media without complaint and without attempted correction. The imperative on the anniversary of 9/11 is learn something from it. America's not learning. America's becoming more determinedly ignorant and more blind to the realities, not just in Iraq or Afghanistan, but all over the world. This is a dangerous and unacceptable condition, and as a nation, as a polity, as a society, we've got to find a way to correct it. I give up. Let's do some dialoguing, and let's talk about this or anything else that you want to talk about. And by the way, if you would stand and identify yourself, and I warn you, because we're recording this, I am going to repeat the questions. There's the media asserting, or the medium here asserting itself.
I'm Stephanie DeGroat. I'm a Knight Wallace Fellow here, so I'm in the business as well. But you paint a very bleak picture, and what can we do? Is there any ray of hope? Because aren't we just as guilty of this ignorance? So what can we do to turn this around as viewers, as people who consume?
How's the market for SUVs these days? Not very good. Why? Because the economic reality of the world militates against buying one. Americans have responded to that, and now General Motors is going to respond to that. If consumers are demanding, then those who are trying to sell them products or attention span will have to respect them. It's an indirect, slow-moving, and very frustrating process, but it's what we've got, I think. Americans have simply got to be more demanding of their media. They should be letting the networks and the cable systems know that they object to the way they are doing things. I think you saw that, you have seen that recently. Even though in many ways this was a top-down rebellion at NBC, with people like Tom Brokaw and Brian Williams going to their bosses and saying, what you're doing on MSNBC is tainting all of our brands. You must reestablish the distinction between news person and analyst spinmeister. And NBC has responded. And again, it wasn't just because Brokaw and Williams said so, it's because people at the Republican convention chanted NBC, NBC, NBC when Sarah Palin complained about the way in which the media had been covering her. There is widespread public dissatisfaction with the television coverage of this election campaign. You can make yourselves heard. You can make yourselves felt. And the evidence is before you.
I was listening to Diane Rehm this morning, in which the conversation got rather heated between a Sarah Palin handler and I think it was a Washington Post reporter. But anyway, the handler seemed to feel that the medium has no right to explore any of this very shallow resume. What are your feelings on how the media should, on Washington Week, there was a reporter who said, we're going to report on this person because we know nothing, but it seems as though our handlers would like us to know nothing.
The question is, and I forgot to repeat Stephanie's question, forgive me, medium. The question is, how should journalists be dealing with the challenge of pursuing Sarah Palin's credentials to be vice president? I think part of the problem is that the first response literally was, well, who's she? We don't know anything about her, therefore she couldn't be credible. And all over America, people say, well, you don't know about me. Does that mean that I'm not credible? What arrogant stupidity. I mean, clearly the first response should have been, what an interesting choice. Now we need to report out who this woman is and what her credentials are. And I think if it had been presented that way, if the investigation had not been preceded by a presumptive judgment, oh, well, she can't be any good, and now we'll prove it. If it was, Who is she? Let us find out. She may be, the great find that John McCain thinks she is, or she may be the underqualified people that her opponents say she is, but we need to find out, which is a way of saying we need to shut up until we know something. And, a television doesn't just cause ignorance, it retails it. And this has become a real problem. This election campaign has sort of, a patriot's dream was of a national election in which people were so engaged that they thought about and talked about it all the time. And cable news has managed to turn that dream into a nightmare. Because the talk that they've provided has almost never been a search for reality or truth. It's been, let's have an argument between X and Y. People are selected for panels not because they know something, but because they can be counted upon to fight with one another. This produces a lot of heat, but it doesn't produce much light.
My name is Tom Rollins. You're talking about the automotive business and basically how it's disintegrating over the last couple of years. I would venture to say the same thing in journalism. Over the last 20 years, I've been stunned how it's just deteriorated. With the lack of revenues coming in, I guess, from the advertising. Do you really have any substantive suggestions that's really going to change, alter the media? And I guess a simple question to put to you would be, would you have your son even, or your child go into journalism now the way it is and what the future looks for?
Well, as somebody who is, re-engineering his own professional career and is aiming at now a career in teaching journalism, these are really serious questions. I'm going to spend the first year of that teaching in China, which is a wholly different context and in which I can absolutely justify teaching the principles of journalism. But if I were teaching journalism in the United States, I would be asking myself, now what exactly is the profession for which I am preparing these people? And since I've been sort of a contrarian for 50 years, can I in good conscience try and create a cohort of latter-day contrarians to go put their heads into the bricks? It's a very, very tough question. The real issue here, to me, the real mission, if you will, for journalism is to find an economic model in the era in which the internet is already becoming and will eventually become the dominant mode of information exchange. What is the economic model within the internet context that can support real good reporting? The first thing that's got to happen is we really have to rethink and readjust the whole sort of economy and society of journalism. When I got into the business, and next year it'll be 50 years, the presumption was that if you got into journalism, you were going to make less money. The presumption was that journalism was a public service profession, and that you sacrificed money in order to have the good feeling of doing something socially useful and perhaps influencing decisions that bettered society or corrected faults in society. I have to say, over the 50 years, as the economy of the rest of the nation became conventional for journalism, I benefited. My salary went up. When anchors became millionaires, they did create a rising tide that did lift all boats. But in general, like much of the economy, much too much of the financial rewards in journalism are concentrated at the absolute top. And the salaries that are paid to anchors have become preemptive of other positions and other projects within their own news organizations. If you're going to pay somebody 10 or 20 million bucks a year, that's money you can't spend on people that you're going to pay $80,000 a year. Or that's money that you can't say, well, it's going to cost me $150,000 minimum to have a team spend 6 weeks in Iraq. Sorry, but that's going to the anchor. So that at the top and the bottom, and even more at the corporate end, there has to be a public service readjustment here. Again, it wasn't just the journalists who made or projected for themselves financial sacrifices in order to go into public service as journalists. The entrepreneurs of the news media made the same choice. I could make more money making widgets than printing newspapers. But over the last 25 years, the demanded levels of return on profit have become completely indiscriminate. And now the New York Times and NBC and any journalistic organization you can name is supposed to make the same return on shareholder investment as General Motors or Google or any other company. I think, as I say, we need to really rethink the role of news media in society and concede that because it's of such importance to society, that financial sacrifice in its advancement is called for. You know, the same thing used to be true of utilities. If you invested in a utility, the good news was they paid a dividend, twice a year, every year. The bad news was the rate of return on the dividend, and certainly the rate of return on profit, was presumed to be half the private sector. Well, in the world of Enron, that got all tossed on its head, and it's only after Enron that people started asking themselves, well, is the value of public power so important? And are the public needs as consumers of power and energy so inflexible? The perfect case I remember in San Diego during the California energy crisis was a woman who essentially lived on a lung machine. They turned off her power, they turned her off. People need the services of utilities, and so maybe there's a political and social choice to be made here that is a different sector of the economy that has different rules for payback and reward because of the essential role that it plays in the greater society. I think we were better off with AT&T run as a utility than Enron run as a Ponzi scheme.
My name is Gus Amaru. How complicit do you think the schools of communication have been in this tendency to blur the distinction between video reportage and genuine journalistic analytical work?
The question is, how complicit have schools of communication and journalism been in this deterioration of standards and performance? They've been part of it, I think, is the answer. They have not played the role of aggressive critics. They have not played the role of monitors. They have not tried to impose any kind of value judgment on what constitutes good reporting or bad reporting. They've taken a sort of technocratic approach of, well, we're preparing people for jobs, and it's our responsibility to make them employable, and if the grounds for their employment are not what we would want, so be it. Our responsibility is to the students, and that's not a dismissible argument. I mean, obviously, that's got to be factored into the argument. As I say, creating a generation of rebellious Marashes would not be a contribution to anybody. But still, the media has been allowed, the news media have been allowed to deteriorate, to lower their standards, to the point where now everybody knows it. It's a cliche. It was 15 years ago when Dirty Laundry was a rock and roll hit, that local news had become contemptible. And now I think there is a very high consensus that national and global news is becoming contemptible. But what do you replace it with? And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are replacing it with contempt and anger and scorn and rage. And here you have the career of Rush Limbaugh, or the rhetorical style of Sarah Palin, I would say.
I think we have time for just one more question.
All right.
My name is Susan Blake. One comment and perhaps one quick question. I use a rooftop antenna, and I have a rotor, and I pulled in TVO Ontario. That's TVO 32 from Ontario. About 3 or 4 years ago, just randomly fell on it. I watched it just last night when Steve Paikin, who runs a 5-day show there called The Agenda. Actually, the topic that was a repeat, but last night was on 9/11 and the conspiracy theories, which I had not followed. But he has wonderful talking heads. It's a channel, a Canadian channel, that just gives the greatest information for me as an American and on the world. And I'm so glad I can pull that station in with my antenna. I wouldn't be able to get it elsewhere. Secondly, I listen to the BBC in the wee hours of the morning that we get through WUOM, and watched BBC News on TV. That's the way I hear so much, not only about what's going on in the world, but outsiders' viewpoints on our current American policies. And my one question about the BBC is, and you'd think we as Americans, we could afford to do something like this, is their world, that channel from Bush House, that they have these reporters in 80 or more countries of the world feeding info, and then it's disseminated on their broadcasts. It must cost a bit for them to do that, but I've never asked directly, how is it that they've created a world news service like that puts out tentacles all over? And unless I'm out of it here in the States because I don't watch cable or whatever, maybe we have something comparable, but I guess we don't. And wouldn't it be great if we were more, as you say, if we were more world-oriented with our news? But I rely on the BBC for a lot of my news.
Well, the short answer, of course, is that BBC is taxpayer-supported and fee-supported, user fee-supported, and the United States has decided that it would rather keep an open market structure. The really good news is, of course, that you can access foreign channels, particularly via the internet. The place that I worked for 2 years, Al Jazeera, I've certainly got my beefs with them about their coverage of the United States, but south of the equator, or the notional south, everywhere outside the first world, to my mind, they're by far the best news channel on the planet. And even when they're at their most scurrilous and annoying, pointing fingers at the US, people need to hear that. People need to know what the rest of the world is seeing and thinking. The fact that Al Jazeera has effectively been boycotted off of America's cable and satellite channels is, again, auto-lobotomy. You don't have to love them, but before you hate them, you ought to make a reasoned judgment of why you hate them. You ought to know what's wrong with them. We have closed ourselves off. And as I say, in many of the aspects of the bad new world theory is that America is enclosing itself behind border walls, behind extremely aggressive immigration prosecutions and summary deportations, behind ever-increasing domestic forms of surveillance, all of which shut down the society, and to me, weaken the very thing that has kept us largely immune from terrorism. The thing that defeats terrorism in the United States is it's Mao's theory of gorillas are like fish that swim in the sea. Well, America is a sea that is toxic to conspiratorial gorilla fish. And that's our strength. That's our blessing. Thank you all so much. I wish that I could go on, but it's been a lot of fun.